15th of September, 1940, 11 o'clock in the morning. Squadron leader Douglas Bader pushed his throttle forward and watched his Hawker Hurricane surge ahead of the formation. Below him, stretched across the Kent countryside like a dark swarm of locusts, flew the largest German bomber formation he'd ever seen. 187 aircraft, Heinkel 111s, Dornier 17s, Junkers 88s, and protecting them, nearly 300 Messerschmitt 109s. The Luftwaffe was throwing everything it had at London. This was supposed to be the knockout blow, the raid that would break British resistance. Hermann Göring had promised Hitler that the RAF was finished, that Fighter Command had fewer than 50 serviceable aircraft left. The Germans were wrong, terribly, fatally wrong. Bader's squadron flew Hurricanes, not the glamorous Spitfire that captured headlines and imaginations, not the sleek, modern fighter that looked fast just sitting on the ground. The Hurricane was the RAF's workhorse, chunky, sturdy, built with old-fashioned fabric-covered wings and a thick fuselage. German intelligence officers had dismissed it as outdated, a relic of a previous era that would be easy meat for their modern fighters. They were about to learn otherwise. Bader rolled his Hurricane into a diving attack. Around him, 230 RAF fighters were doing the same. Every squadron in Fighter Command that could get airborne was converging on the German formation, and more than half of them flew Hurricanes. What happened in the next hour would decide the fate of Britain, and the Hurricane, the supposedly obsolete fighter that German pilots had learned to dismiss, would prove to be the Luftwaffe's nightmare. November 19th, 35. Brooklands Airfield, Surrey. Chief Test Pilot Squadron Leader Philip Lucas climbed into the cockpit of a fighter aircraft that looked nothing like the sleek racers dominating aviation headlines. The prototype was chunky and workmanlike. Fabric-covered wings, fixed-pitch wooden propeller, bulky fuselage. It looked more like a 1928 design than a modern fighter. Sidney Cam, Hawker Aircraft's chief designer, had created something that contradicted every trend in fighter development. While other designers chased speed and sleekness, Cam had prioritized simplicity, ruggedness, and practicality. The Hurricane was designed to be easy to build, easy to repair, and easy to fly. It was a fighter optimized for war, not peacetime air shows. The Air Ministry was skeptical. They'd seen the specifications for the Supermarine Spitfire. That was a proper modern fighter. All metal construction, retractable undercarriage, stressed skin fuselage. The Hurricane seemed primitive by comparison. Some officials argued it shouldn't enter production at all. Squadron leader Ralph Sorley, a forward-thinking Air Ministry officer, disagreed. He'd done calculations that others had ignored. A fighter needed to destroy bombers quickly and decisively. That meant heavy armament. Rifle-caliber machine guns weren't enough anymore. Bombers were getting tougher, with self-sealing fuel tanks and armored crew positions. Sorley argued for 8 machine guns. 8. Every other fighter in the world had 2, maybe 4. 8 seemed excessive, but Sorley's mathematics were irrefutable. A bomber needed to absorb multiple hits to go down. More guns meant more hits in the brief firing opportunity of combat. More hits meant more kills. Cam redesigned the Hurricane's wing to accommodate 8 Browning 303 machine guns, 4 in each wing. The thick wing, which critics had mocked as old-fashioned, proved perfect for the installation. The guns nestled inside, protected from the elements, with ample ammunition and reliable feed systems. The prototype flew beautifully. Lucas reported that it handled like a dream. Stable, forgiving, responsive. A pilot's aircraft. Easy to land, which was critical for inexperienced wartime pilots. Easy to aim, which was essential for effective gunnery. And surprisingly fast. With a more powerful engine and better propeller, it could exceed 300 miles per hour. The Air Ministry ordered 600 Hurricanes in June 1936, before the first production aircraft had even flown. It was the largest peacetime order for military aircraft in British history. Some officials thought it reckless. Sidney Cam thought it was barely adequate. Production began in 1937. The Hurricane's design proved its worth immediately. Unlike the Spitfire, which required complex jigs and skilled metalworkers, the Hurricane could be built quickly with available materials and standard techniques. The fuselage was a metal tube framework covered with fabric. Simple, proven, easy to repair in the field. Battle damage that would write off a Spitfire could be patched on a Hurricane overnight. Fabric could be replaced with needle and thread. Bent tubes could be straightened. Damaged sections could be cut out and new ones welded in place. Maintenance crews loved it. What took days to repair on other aircraft took hours on a Hurricane. By September 1939, when war was declared, the RAF had 18 Hurricane squadrons operational. That was more squadrons than all other fighter types combined. The Hurricane wasn't glamorous, but it was available. And availability, as it turned out, mattered more than anyone had anticipated. The first months of the war demonstrated the Hurricane's qualities. In France, Hurricane squadrons engaged the Luftwaffe regularly. They discovered their fighter could hold its own against the vaunted Messerschmitt 109. The Hurricane was slower in level flight. It couldn't climb quite as fast, but it could turn inside the German fighter, and those 8 Browning guns were devastating against bombers. Flight Lieutenant Paul Ritchie, flying Hurricanes with No. 1 Squadron in France, described his first kill. "I closed to 100 yards on a Heinkel 111, lined up behind and slightly below, thumbed the firing button, and all 8 guns spoke. I'd never experienced anything like it. The whole aircraft shook. I saw my bullets tearing into the Heinkel's fuselage. Pieces flew off. Smoke poured from the port engine. 5 seconds of fire, and it was finished. The bomber rolled over and went down." The Luftwaffe pilots began reporting encounters with British fighters armed with cannon. They couldn't believe machine guns could produce such concentrated firepower. 8 streams of bullets converging created a lethal cone of fire. Anything caught in that cone was shredded. But the Hurricane's greatest test was yet to come. After the fall of France, Hitler turned his attention to Britain. Operation Célion, the invasion of England, required air superiority. The Luftwaffe would have to destroy the RAF. Hermann Göring promised it would take 4 days. 4 days to sweep British fighters from the sky and leave Britain defenseless. The Battle of Britain was about to begin, and the Hurricane would prove it was anything but outdated. 10th of July, 1940, the Air Ministry designated this as the official start of the Battle of Britain. Luftwaffe formations began attacking Channel convoys and coastal targets. German intelligence estimated the RAF had fewer than 700 fighters. They were wrong. Fighter Command had over 1,000 aircraft available, though not all were serviceable at any moment. More importantly, 600 of those fighters were Hurricanes, the RAF's backbone, the aircraft that would bear the heaviest burden of the coming battle. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding commanded Fighter Command. He was a cautious, methodical man whom some considered pessimistic. But Dowding understood mathematics. He calculated that Fighter Command needed to maintain a minimum of fighter strength to remain effective, lose too many pilots and aircraft too quickly, and the whole system would collapse. Dowding divided his forces carefully. Spitfire squadrons would engage German fighters, which they were better suited to combat. Hurricane squadrons would focus on the bombers. It was simple, logical, and it played to each aircraft's strengths. The Spitfire was faster and could outmaneuver the Messerschmitt 109. The Hurricane was tougher and had better firepower for attacking bombers. German pilots, briefed by their intelligence officers, were told the Hurricane was inferior to their fighters. Obsolete, a transitional aircraft that the British were forced to use because they didn't have enough Spitfires. Attack Hurricanes aggressively. They won't put up much fight. Oberleutnant Franz von Vera, a Luftwaffe pilot who would later be shot down and captured, recalled the briefing. "We were shown pictures of British fighters. The Spitfire was described as dangerous, modern, well-armed. The Hurricane was described as old-fashioned, slow, poorly armed. We were told most RAF fighters would be Hurricanes because the British had started building them earlier. This was good news. It meant easy victories." The German assessment was based on outdated information and fundamental misunderstanding. Yes, the Hurricane looked old-fashioned with its fabric-covered wings. Yes, it was slightly slower than the Messerschmitt in level flight, but outdated implied ineffective. The Hurricane was anything but. On 12th of August, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched its first major assault, Adler Angriff, Eagle Attack. The goal was to destroy RAF airfields and draw Fighter Command into a battle of annihilation. Over 1,000 aircraft participated in waves of attacks throughout the day. Hurricane squadrons scrambled to meet them. What followed shattered German expectations. Number 85, Squadron flying Hurricanes from Martlesham Heath intercepted a formation of Dornier 17 bombers over the Thames estuary. Squadron leader Peter Townsend led the attack. His combat report, filed that evening, was clinical. Engaged enemy bombers at 15,000 feet. Attacked from astern and quarter. Observed strikes on fuselage and starboard engine. Enemy aircraft fell away smoking. Engaged second bomber. Observed strikes on port wing and fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded. Ammunition expended. Returned to base. Townsend had shot down 2 bombers in less than 3 minutes. His wingmen had destroyed 3 more. 5 Dorniers down from 1 squadron in 1 engagement. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Hurricanes were supposed to be easy targets. The Luftwaffe pilots quickly learned that the Hurricane, while not as fast as their fighters, was extraordinarily maneuverable. In a turning fight, a Hurricane could stay inside a Messerschmitt's turn radius. This negated the German fighters' speed advantage. If you couldn't point your guns at the enemy, being faster didn't matter. More significantly, the Hurricane could absorb incredible punishment. Its fabric-covered structure seemed primitive until you realized that bullets passed through fabric without fragmenting. On metal aircraft, bullets striking aluminium skin created sharp fragments that caused secondary damage. On the Hurricane, bullets often passed clean through, making holes but not destroying structure. Flight Lieutenant James Nicholson of No. 249 Squadron experienced this firsthand on 16th of August. His Hurricane was hit by cannon fire from a Messerschmitt 110. Shells exploded in the cockpit and engine. Nicholson was wounded in the foot and eye. Fire erupted in the cockpit. Fuel was burning. He was about to bail out when he spotted a Messerschmitt 110 directly ahead. Nicholson, despite his wounds and the fire, stayed in the burning cockpit long enough to shoot the German fighter down. Only then did he bail out. He was badly burned, but survived. For his actions, he received the only Victoria, Cross awarded to Fighter Command during the entire war. But the remarkable part of the story isn't just Nicholson's courage. It's that the Hurricane, hit by multiple cannon shells, on fire, still flew well enough for him to make an accurate attack and shoot down an enemy fighter. The aircraft's toughness was extraordinary. German pilots began reporting that Hurricanes required far more ammunition to destroy than they'd expected. Hauptmann Horst Tietzen, flying Messerschmitt 109s with Jagdgeschwader 51, wrote in his log, "Engaged Hurricane fighters over Dover, scored multiple hits. Enemy aircraft did not go down, continued fighting, eventually disengaged due to low ammunition. The British fighters are more resilient than we were told." By late August, the pattern was clear. Hurricanes were accounting for the majority of Luftwaffe losses, not because they were superior fighters in dogfights, though they held their own, but because there were more of them, because they focused on the bombers, and because those 8 Browning guns were absolutely lethal against large aircraft. The statistics were undeniable. In August 1940 alone, Hurricane squadrons claimed over 600 enemy aircraft destroyed. Some claims were certainly duplicates or overestimates, as is common in the chaos of combat. But even accounting for overclaiming, Hurricanes were destroying far more German aircraft than any other fighter type. The Luftwaffe was bleeding, and the aircraft they'd dismissed as outdated was doing most of the damage. 15th of September, 1940. This date would become known as Battle of Britain Day, the Luftwaffe's final attempt to achieve the knockout blow that would force Britain to surrender. Hermann Goering had restructured his tactics. Daylight raids by massive formations with heavy fighter escort. The bombers would target London. The civilian population would panic. The RAF would be forced to commit every available fighter, and the Luftwaffe's superior numbers would crush them. The morning raid began at 10:30. 100 bomber aircraft crossed the Channel, escorted by over 300 fighters. It was the largest formation yet assembled. German air crews were confident. British fighter strength had to be nearly exhausted after weeks of continuous combat. Park's No. 11 group scrambled every available squadron. Hurricanes from Northolt, Tangmere, North Weald, Spitfires from Biggin Hill and Hornchurch. The formations climbed to intercept over Kent. Squadron leader Douglas Bader, leading the Duxford wing of 5 squadrons, spotted the German formation first. 3 of his 5 squadrons flew Hurricanes. 60 aircraft in total, 36 of them Hurricanes. They had altitude advantage. Bader's voice crackled over the radio. "Tally-ho! Attacking now!" The Hurricane squadrons went for the bombers. The tactics were simple and brutally effective. High-speed diving attack from above and astern, close to me. 300 yards. Open fire with all 8 guns. Rake the target from tail to nose. Break away before the fighter escort could react. Pilot Officer William Walker of No. 242 Squadron described his attack. I picked out a Dornier at the rear of the formation, dove from 17,000 feet. The Hurricane accelerated beautifully in the dive. I lined up dead astern slightly below to avoid return fire from the upper gunner. At 300 yards, I opened fire. I could see my bullets walking up the fuselage. The rear gunner's position shattered. Pieces flew off. Then the starboard engine caught fire. I held the trigger down for perhaps 5 seconds. When I broke away, the Dornier was falling, both engines burning. Walker's experience was repeated dozens of times that morning. German bomber formations were torn apart by Hurricane attacks. Dornier 17s fell in flames. Heinkel 111s staggered out of formation trailing smoke. Junkers 88s jettisoned their bombs and ran for home. The German fighter escort tried to intervene, but the Messerschmitts were at a disadvantage. They'd climbed to high altitude escorting the bombers. Their engines were running hot. Their fuel was depleting. And the British fighters had altitude advantage, diving from above with speed and energy on their side. Oberleutnant Julius Neumann, flying with Jagdgeschwader 27, later wrote about the experience. We expected to find a handful of exhausted British fighters. Instead, the sky was full of them. They came from above, from the sides, from every direction. The Hurricanes went straight for our bombers. We tried to stop them, but there were too many. For every one we drove off, 2 more attacked. I shot down 1 Hurricane, but watched 3 of our bombers fall. It was a disaster. The morning raid was driven back. 24 German bombers failed to return. Dozens more landed with severe damage. The fighter escort had lost over 20 aircraft. The Luftwaffe assembled for a second attempt in the afternoon. This time, 114 bombers crossed the channel at 2 o'clock. Again, massive fighter escort. Over 250 Messerschmitts. Goering had committed everything available. Again, Fighter Command rose to meet them. Hurricanes from every available squadron. The afternoon combat was even more intense than the morning. Over London, hundreds of aircraft swirled in a massive dogfight. Parachutes blossomed like dandelions. Aircraft fell trailing fire. The sky was crisscrossed with contrails and smoke. Flying Officer Jeffrey Page, piloting a Hurricane with No. 56 Squadron, shot down 3 German bombers in 15 minutes. His combat report noted, the bombers were packed close together, difficult to miss. Each attack resulted in observable damage. On the 3rd attack, my ammunition ran out, returned to Rochford, rearmed, refueled, back in the air in 20 minutes. Engaged a second formation, destroyed 1 more. Bomber before fuel ran low. Page's experience illustrated the Hurricane's operational advantage. Quick turnaround times, simple maintenance, reliable systems. Pilots could fly multiple sorties in a single day. The Hurricane's ease of servicing meant more time in the air and less time on the ground. By evening, the Luftwaffe had suffered catastrophic losses. The RAF initially claimed 185 German aircraft destroyed. This was an overestimate, as later research proved. The actual German losses were 56 aircraft, but 56 was still devastating. In a single day, the Luftwaffe had lost nearly 60 bombers and fighters, crews killed or captured, aircraft that couldn't be quickly replaced. More importantly, the psychological impact was enormous. The Luftwaffe had thrown its best punch. Fighter Command had not only survived, it had hit back harder. The myth of German invincibility was shattered, and the Hurricane, the supposedly outdated fighter, had done most of the damage. Of the 56 confirmed German losses on 15th of September, Hurricane pilots had accounted for at least 38. Spitfires, despite their fame, had destroyed fewer aircraft because there were fewer of them available, and they'd spent much of their time engaged with German fighters rather than bombers. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Celion indefinitely. The invasion of Britain was off. The Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority, and that failure meant Germany couldn't invade. Britain had won the Battle of Britain, and the Hurricane had been the weapon that delivered victory. When historians analyze the Battle of Britain, one statistic stands out above all others. Hurricane pilots were credited with destroying more enemy aircraft than all other British fighters combined. The official tally shows Hurricanes accounted for approximately 60% of all Luftwaffe losses during the battle. This wasn't because the Hurricane was a better fighter than the Spitfire. In pure performance, the Spitfire was superior. Faster, better climbing, more maneuverable at altitude. But there were twice as many Hurricanes available. And the Hurricane's design made it the better bomber-destroyer. The 8 Browning guns were devastating against large aircraft. Each gun fired 1,100 rounds per minute. All 8 firing together produced 8,800 rounds per minute. That's 147 bullets every second. The bullets were loaded in a specific pattern: armor-piercing, incendiary, tracer, ball, repeated. This ensured that every burst contained rounds capable of penetrating armor, setting fuel on fire, and providing visible feedback for aiming. A 3-second burst put 440 rounds into the target area. German bombers, despite their armor and self-sealing tanks, couldn't withstand that kind of punishment. Engines would fail, fuel would ignite, control surfaces would be shot away, the bombers would fall. Squadron leader Tom Gleave of No. 253 Squadron calculated that a well-aimed 3-second burst from a Hurricane had an 80% probability of destroying a Heinkel 111. Compare this to single-gun or two-gun fighters from earlier in the decade, which required sustained fire and multiple attacks to achieve the same result. The Hurricane's stability as a gun platform contributed to its effectiveness. Unlike highly maneuverable fighters that were twitchy and required constant pilot input, the Hurricane was steady. Pointed at the target, trim it out, and it would hold that position while you fired. This made accurate gunnery easier, especially for less experienced pilots. And experience levels varied dramatically. The RAF was training new pilots as fast as possible, but training time had been cut from 6 months to 4 weeks for some. These barely trained pilots were being thrown into combat. In a Spitfire, their lack of experience could be fatal. The Spitfire was a thoroughbred that required skill to fly well. The Hurricane was forgiving. It didn't punish mistakes as harshly. Flight Lieutenant Peter Brothers, who flew both Hurricanes and Spitfires during the battle, explained it this way. The Spitfire was the fighter you wanted if you were an experienced pilot facing other fighters. It was fast, agile, beautiful to fly. But it was unforgiving. You had to know what you were doing. The Hurricane was the fighter you wanted if you were inexperienced, or if you were attacking bombers, or if you were damaged and trying to get home. It was stable, tough, reliable. It kept you alive while you learned. And it killed bombers with brutal efficiency. The numbers support this. Hurricane losses per sortie were actually lower than Spitfire losses during the Battle of Britain. This seems counterintuitive, given that Hurricanes were engaging bombers with defensive gunners. But the Hurricane's toughness and the fact that less experienced pilots were often assigned to Hurricane squadrons meant the aircraft brought more pilots home alive. Pilot Officer Jeffrey Wellham, who flew Spitfires, admitted in his memoir, "We got the glory and the headlines. The Spitfire was the aircraft everyone talked about, but the Hurricane pilots were doing the real work. They were going after the bombers, taking the defensive fire, getting shot up, and still bringing their aircraft home. We respected them enormously. The Luftwaffe certainly respected them." By October 1940, German intelligence had completely revised their assessment of the Hurricane. No longer was it described as outdated or inferior. Reports now classified it as extremely dangerous, particularly to bombers. Well-armed and resilient. Pilots show high skill and determination. Hauptmann Adolf Galland, one of Germany's top aces who would later command the Luftwaffe fighter force, was asked after the war which British fighter he feared most. His answer surprised many. The Spitfire was a worthy opponent in combat, but the Hurricane was the one that destroyed our bomber force. It wasn't as glamorous, but it was more effective at its job. If I had to choose which one to face, I'd rather face Spitfires. At least with a Spitfire, you knew you were in a fair fight between fighters. The Hurricane was optimized to kill bombers, and it did that job better than any fighter I encountered. As the Battle of Britain progressed into autumn 1940, the Hurricane evolved. Pilots discovered new tactics. Engineers developed improvements. The aircraft became more lethal. One significant development was the Hurricane Mark II, which entered service in September 1940. This variant featured the more powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin 20 engine, producing 1,300 horsepower compared to the Mark I's 1,040 horsepower. The extra power improved climb rate and high-altitude performance. More significantly, some Hurricane Mark IIs were fitted with 12 Browning guns instead of 8. 4 guns in each wing became 6. The firepower was already impressive. Now it became overwhelming. A 3-second burst put 660 rounds into the target. Nothing flew through that and survived. Squadron leader Robert Stanford Tuck, a highly successful ace, test flew a 12-gun Hurricane and reported, "The recoil when all 12 guns fired was noticeable. The whole aircraft shuddered, but the effect on target was incredible. I fired at a ground target for testing. The concentration of fire was like a saw. It didn't just damage the target, it obliterated it. Any bomber hit by that would simply come apart." The 12-gun configuration was primarily used by specialist squadrons tasked with night bomber interception. During the Blitz, when German bombers attacked British cities at night, Hurricane night fighters prowled the darkness looking for targets. The heavy armament meant a single brief firing opportunity was often enough to destroy a bomber. Another development was cannon-armed Hurricanes. Some aircraft were fitted with 4 20mm Hispano cannons instead of machine guns. The cannons had less ammunition, only 60 rounds per gun, but each shell was far more destructive than a machine gun bullet. A single cannon hit could blow a wing off. 2 or 3 hits would destroy any aircraft. The cannon-armed Hurricanes, designated Mark IIc, were used against heavily armored targets and later against shipping. But most pilots preferred the machine gun armament. The reliability was better, the ammunition capacity much higher, and the weight of fire from 8 or 12 machine guns was sufficient for almost any target. The Hurricane also proved adaptable to other roles. When the Luftwaffe shifted to night bombing, Hurricanes were modified for night fighting. When German fighter bombers began hit-and-run raids on coastal targets, Hurricanes were scrambled for rapid interception. When the RAF needed aircraft for ground attack, Hurricanes were fitted with bombs and rockets. This versatility came from the same design philosophy that had made the Hurricane successful in the first place. Simple, rugged, adaptable. The thick wing could accommodate different weapons. The strong structure could handle modifications. The reliable systems kept working under harsh conditions. By early 1941, Hurricanes were operating in multiple theaters. In North Africa, they fought Italian and German aircraft. In the Mediterranean, they defended Malta against constant attack. In the Far East, they opposed the Japanese. The aircraft that had been designed for European combat proved effective everywhere it was deployed. But it was during the Battle of Britain that the Hurricane earned its reputation. Those critical months between July and October 1940, when Britain stood alone against the German onslaught, the Hurricane had been there, taking the hits, bringing pilots home, destroying bombers. The final tally for the Battle of Britain makes remarkable reading. Fighter Command claimed over 2,600 enemy aircraft destroyed. The actual figure, confirmed by German records, was closer to 1,700. Overt claiming was inevitable in the chaos of combat, with multiple pilots sometimes shooting at the same aircraft. But even using the conservative German figures, Hurricanes accounted for approximately 60% of Luftwaffe losses. That's roughly 1,000 aircraft destroyed by Hurricane pilots, and the majority of those were bombers, the aircraft that posed the actual threat to Britain. Messerschmitt 109s could strafe and bomb, but they couldn't carry enough ordnance to seriously damage Britain's war production or break civilian morale. The bombers were the strategic threat, and the Hurricane had systematically destroyed them. Today, when people think of the Battle of Britain, they think of Spitfires. The Spitfire has become the iconic symbol of that desperate summer. Museums display Spitfires. Films feature Spitfires. The graceful elliptical wings and sleek fuselage are instantly recognizable. The Hurricane is often forgotten or relegated to footnote status. The aircraft that filled in until enough Spitfires were available. This perception is not just wrong, it's backwards. During the Battle of Britain, Hurricanes outnumbered Spitfires by nearly 2 to 1. There were 32 Hurricane squadrons and 19 Spitfire squadrons at the battle's peak. The Hurricane wasn't filling in for the Spitfire. The Spitfire was supplementing the Hurricane. More importantly, the Hurricane's design was exactly what Britain needed. a fighter that could be produced quickly with available materials and workforce, a fighter that could be maintained by relatively unskilled ground crew using basic tools, a fighter that inexperienced pilots could fly without killing themselves, and a fighter that could destroy the enemy's bombers with brutal efficiency. Sidney Cam's design philosophy of simplicity and practicality proved superior to more advanced designs that required scarce materials and skilled labor. The Spitfire was undoubtedly a better pure fighter, but Britain didn't need a small number of excellent fighters. It needed a large number of good enough fighters immediately. The Hurricane provided that, and it did so while proving to be far more capable than its detractors expected. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, who commanded Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain, was clear about the Hurricane's importance. In his official dispatch written after the battle, he stated, "The Hurricane force bore the brunt of the fighting. They destroyed more enemy aircraft than all other defenses combined, both active and passive. The victory was won by the courage and skill of our pilots, but it was won flying Hawker Hurricanes." The statistics support Dowding's assessment. Of the 2,937 RAF pilots who flew in the Battle of Britain, 1,731 flew Hurricanes. Of the 544 pilots killed, 332 were Hurricane pilots. They paid the highest price and achieved the greatest results. Pilot Officer Jeffrey Page, who was shot down and badly burned during the battle, later wrote, "The Spitfire won the hearts. The Hurricane won the battle. We who flew Hurricanes knew we were in the less glamorous aircraft. We didn't care. We knew what we were achieving. We knew that every bomber we destroyed was one less load of bombs falling on London or Coventry or Birmingham. We were doing the essential work." The essential work continued long after the Battle of Britain ended. Hurricanes fought in every major theater of the war. They destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other Allied fighter. They proved adaptable to ground attack, carrying bombs and rockets against tanks and vehicles. They operated from aircraft carriers, from rough jungle airstrips, from desert landing grounds. The last Hurricane was delivered in July 1944. By then, over 14,500 had been built, more than any other British fighter. They'd served in the air forces of 18 nations. They'd fought on every continent except Antarctica. They'd been flown by pilots from Britain, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, Belgium, and the Soviet Union. And they'd started it all during those desperate summer months of 1940, when Britain stood alone and the fate of the free world hung in the balance. When the war ended, historians and analysts began examining what had happened during the Battle of Britain. How had the RAF, outnumbered and outgunned, defeated the Luftwaffe? What had gone wrong with German strategy? Why had British fighter defenses proven so effective? The answers were complex. Radar early warning systems, effective command and control, skilled pilots, home field advantage, German tactical mistakes. All of these factors contributed, but at the core of British success was a simple fact. The Hurricane worked. It worked well, it worked reliably, and there were enough of them to matter. German planning had assumed the RAF would field small numbers of advanced fighters. The intelligence estimates were catastrophically wrong. Fighter Command had over 1,000 fighters available, and most of them were Hurricanes. Sturdy, reliable, effective Hurricanes that could be repaired quickly and put back into action. The Luftwaffe's own fighters, while excellent aircraft, couldn't match British production rates. Germany built fewer than 2,000 Messerschmitt 109s in 1940. Britain built over 2,000 Hurricanes in the same period, plus over 700 Spitfires. The production advantage was overwhelming, and that production advantage came directly from the Hurricane's design. It was easier to build than a Spitfire. It used less critical materials. It required less skilled labor. A factory that could build one Spitfire could build 2 Hurricanes in the same time with the same resources. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, who commanded Luftflotte II during the Battle of Britain, was interrogated after the war about German failures. His assessment was blunt. We underestimated British fighter strength by at least 50%. We underestimated British production capacity even more severely, and we completely misunderstood the Hurricane. We thought it was an obsolete aircraft kept in service because nothing better was available. In reality, it was a superbly practical fighting machine designed specifically for the defensive battle it fought. Our intelligence failed us completely. The failure of German intelligence regarding the Hurricane stemmed from a fundamental misunderstanding of aircraft design philosophy. German designers prioritized performance, speed, climb rate, altitude. British designers, or at least Sidney Cam, prioritized effectiveness. The Hurricane didn't need to be the fastest or highest flying. It needed to destroy bombers and survive combat. It did both exceptionally well. Post-war analysis by the RAF's Operational Research Section examined combat effectiveness of different fighter types. Their conclusion was illuminating. Per unit of industrial resource invested, the Hurricane provided superior combat effectiveness to any other fighter in British service. While the Spitfire had better performance characteristics, the Hurricane's ease of production, maintenance, and operation resulted in more combat-ready aircraft available for more hours of operational flying. In a defensive battle of attrition, this proved decisive. The human factor was equally important. Hurricane pilots developed a fierce loyalty to their aircraft. They trusted it. They knew it would bring them home, even when badly damaged. That confidence affected combat. Performance. Wing Commander Tom Neal, who flew Hurricanes throughout the Battle of Britain and survived the war with 14 victories, explained, "In combat, you can't afford to worry about your aircraft. You need to focus on the enemy. In a Hurricane, you didn't worry. The aircraft did what you asked it to do. The guns worked. The engine kept running. Even when you got shot up, it kept flying. That reliability was priceless. It meant you could concentrate on fighting rather than flying." The reliability extended to the ground crews. Fitters and riggers who maintained the Hurricanes developed similar trust in the aircraft. They knew how to fix it quickly. They knew which systems were robust and which needed attention. They could patch battle damage and have the aircraft serviceable for the next day's operations. Sergeant James Wallace, a fitter with No. 242 Squadron, recorded in his diary, "We turned around Hurricanes faster than any other squadron on the station. Our record was 11 minutes from landing to ready for next sortie. Refuel, rearm, quick inspection, and back in the air. Try doing that with anything else." The Hurricane was designed for war, and it showed. That 11-minute turnaround time meant more sorties per aircraft per day. More sorties meant more interceptions. More interceptions meant more bombers destroyed. The cumulative effect was enormous. The Battle of Britain ended in October 1940 when Hitler accepted that air superiority over Britain was unattainable. The planned invasion was abandoned. Germany turned its attention east toward the Soviet Union. Britain had survived. The Hurricane had been central to that survival. The aircraft would continue fighting for another 4 years. In the Western Desert, Hurricane fighter bombers destroyed Rommel's supply convoys. In Burma, they provided close air support for British troops fighting Japanese forces. In the Soviet Union, thousands of Hurricanes supplied under Lend-Lease fought on the Eastern Front. But the Hurricane's finest hour had been those summer months of 1940, when the aircraft everyone had dismissed as outdated proved to be exactly what Britain needed. The final accounting makes sobering reading. During the Battle of Britain, 1,544 Hurricane pilots flew combat operations. 544 were killed or missing. Another 421 were wounded. The casualty rate exceeded 60%. They'd paid a terrible price, but they'd achieved something precious. They'd stopped the Luftwaffe. They'd prevented the invasion of Britain. They'd kept the flame of resistance alive when most of Europe had fallen to Nazi Germany. And they'd done it flying an aircraft that German intelligence had dismissed as easy prey. An aircraft that critics had called obsolete. An aircraft that proved to be one of the most effective fighters ever built. Sidney Cam lived to see his creation vindicated. He continued designing aircraft for Hawker, including the Typhoon and Tempest fighters that would dominate later war. But he always maintained that the Hurricane was his finest work. Not because it was technically advanced, but because it did exactly what it was designed to do perfectly. In 1946, Cam was asked about the Hurricane's success. His response was characteristically practical. "I designed an aircraft that could be built quickly, flown safely, and maintained easily. I armed it with enough guns to destroy any bomber. I made it strong enough to survive combat and bring pilots home. That's what Britain needed. Technical sophistication is lovely in peacetime. In war, you need things that work." The Hurricane worked. On the 15th of September, 1940, when the fate of Britain hung in the balance, 230 Hurricanes had climbed to meet the largest German raid of the war. They'd torn into the bomber formations with devastating effect. They'd destroyed dozens of enemy aircraft. They'd turned the Luftwaffe back. That day, those Hurricanes flown by those pilots had saved Britain, not through technical sophistication or superior performance, but through sheer, brutal effectiveness, through 8 guns that fired 147 bullets per second, through rugged construction that absorbed punishment and kept flying, through practical design that kept aircraft serviceable and in the air. The Spitfire is remembered as the glamorous fighter of the Battle of Britain. The Hurricane deserves to be remembered as the killer, the tough, unglamorous workhorse that destroyed more enemy aircraft than all other British fighters combined, the aircraft that German pilots learned to fear and respect, the aircraft that won the Battle of Britain. Today, only a handful of Hurricanes still fly. They appear at air shows, graceful and surprisingly agile for such a chunky aircraft. Crowds watch and applaud, but few truly understand what they're seeing. They're seeing the aircraft that stood between Britain and invasion, the aircraft that 200,000 factory workers built in record time, the aircraft that 1,500 pilots flew into combat knowing the odds were against them, the aircraft that destroyed more than 240 Luftwaffe fighters and hundreds more bombers during the desperate summer of 1940. They're seeing the forgotten hero of Britain's finest hour, the Hurricane. Not the fastest, not the most advanced, not the most famous, but when it mattered most, when Britain's survival hung in the balance, the Hurricane was there, tough, reliable, deadly, and that was enough.